You can't just hoard a natural resource like that, she'd shrieked, her voice sharp enough to etch glass. Water is for the community. That was the moment I knew peace was no longer an option. It was the moment the game changed, right there on the edge of my property line, a line she seemed to think was merely a suggestion. Let me back up. Before Brenda, before the lawyers and the late-night camera checks, there was just the quiet hum of the land. I'm a hydrogeologist. I spend my days studying the secret life of water, the way it moves through stone and soil. It's a quiet profession for a quiet man. After my grandfather passed, I inherited his 40 acres, a small, stubborn island of old-growth pine and tangled manzanita surrounded by a rising tide of beige stucco. The property wasn't just land, it was a legacy, a living museum of my family's history, and at its heart was the well. It wasn't just any well. It was a spring-fed artesian well, tapped by my great-great-grandfather back in 1887. The water that flowed from it was cold, clean, and constant, a gift from the deep earth that had sustained 4 generations. My grandfather used to say the water had a memory, that you could taste the minerals of the ages in every sip. For me, it tasted like home. After losing him, I'd moved back to the old homestead, seeking solace in the familiar creak of the floorboards and the sigh of the wind through the pines. My plan was simple: grieve, work remotely, and be left alone. The new development, Whispering Pines Estates, had a name that was a cruel joke. The developers had clear-cut most of the pines, leaving behind a sterile landscape of perfectly manicured lawns and identical houses. It was a homeowners association community, a concept as foreign to my family's land as a skyscraper. My property was an enclave, completely separate, grandfathered in long before the first survey stake for the HOA was ever driven into the ground. I was not a member. I was not subject to their rules. I was, in their eyes, an anomaly. And Brenda, the self-appointed queen of this beige kingdom, could not stand an anomaly. She was the HOA president, a title she wore like a crown of thorns she expected everyone else to bleed from. She was a woman in her late 50s with a helmet of blonde hair that looked like it could deflect small arms fire and eyes that held the cold, judgmental glint of a tax auditor. Our first interaction was predictable. She marched up my long gravel driveway, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. She didn't knock on the door. She simply appeared at the side of my porch where I was enjoying my morning coffee. "Excuse me," she said, her tone implying I was already guilty of something. "I'm Brenda Miller, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." "I know who you are," I replied, not getting up. "And this isn't Whispering Pines. You're about 100 yards past your jurisdiction." A faint pink flush crept up her neck. "I'm here about the unapproved structure." I followed her gaze to my grandfather's old woodshed. It had been standing since the 1940s, its cedar planks weathered to a soft, silver gray. It was leaning a bit, sure, but it was as solid as the rock it was built on. "That shed is older than your entire development," I said, taking a slow sip of coffee. "It's not an unapproved structure. It's called history. According to Covenant 14b, all outbuildings must be painted in an approved earth tone palette and be in a state of perfect repair," she recited, tapping her clipboard. "That thing is an eyesore. It lowers property values. My property has no value to you, and your covenants have no value to me," I said, my patience already wearing thin. "This is private land. It is not part of the HOA. Now, if you don't mind, you're trespassing." She sputtered, her carefully constructed authority cracking like cheap concrete. "We'll see about that." She spun on her sensible heel and marched back down the driveway. I thought that would be the end of it. How naive I was. A week later, the first official-looking letter arrived. It was a $25 fine for the unapproved structure, I wrote, "not applicable," across it in red marker and mailed it back. The real trouble started during the summer drought. The Whispering Pines lawns, once a vibrant, unnatural green, began to turn a sickly yellow. The HOA had strict water rationing rules, enforced with a zealousness usually reserved for religious cults. Fines were handed out for watering on the wrong day, for washing a car, for filling a child's wading pool. The community Facebook page was a war zone of accusations and grainy photos of neighbors' illicitly damp driveways. My property, however, was an oasis. The old well was tireless. My vegetable garden was thriving, my small patch of lawn was green, and the ancient oak trees my grandfather had planted were lush and full. I wasn't flaunting it, I was just living. But to Brenda, my green paradise was a personal insult. She appeared again, this time with 2 other HOA board members in tow, a pair of nervous-looking men who seemed to be there purely for moral, or perhaps physical, support. They stood at the edge of my driveway, a grim little delegation. "We have a serious problem," Brenda announced, skipping the pleasantries. "The community is suffering from a severe water shortage." "I'm aware," I said. "I've seen the lawns." "Your lawn," she said, pointing an accusatory finger, "is suspiciously green. As is everything else." "It's the well," I said simply. "It's spring-fed. Never runs dry." A predatory gleam entered her eyes. It was the look of a wolf spotting a lamb that had wandered away from the flock. This was the moment she saw my grandfather's legacy not as a piece of history, but as a resource to be plundered. "A well," she repeated slowly, savoring the word. "An underground spring. That sounds like a community asset." I almost laughed. "It's on my private property. Drilled by my great-great-grandfather. It's about as far from a community asset as you can get." "That's a very selfish attitude," she snapped. "People here are watching their expensive landscaping die, and you're sitting on an untapped reservoir. The HOA board has determined that in a crisis, all local water sources must be made available for the good of the community. The HOA board can determine that the sky is plaid for all I care," I said, my voice hardening. "This is my water. This conversation is over." I turned to go back inside. That's when she said the words that started the war. "You can't just hoard a natural resource like that. Water is for the community." Her 2 flunkies nodded in solemn agreement. I stopped and turned back to face her, a cold, calm anger settling over me. "Brenda," I said, my voice low and even. "Let me be perfectly clear. You and your board have absolutely no authority here. The next time you set foot on my property, I will have you removed for trespassing. Stay away from my home, and stay away from my well." I went inside and locked the door, my heart pounding with a frustration so pure it felt like a physical force. I looked out the window at the old stone wellhead, the cool, dark water within. It was more than water. It was my heritage, my inheritance, my one tangible link to the men who had raised me. And this woman, this petty tyrant of the suburbs, thought she could just claim it. I knew then that this wasn't going to end with a letter. This was going to get ugly. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was going to have to get uglier. The hydrogeologist, the quiet man who just wanted to be left alone, was going to have to learn how to fight. The official notices started arriving like clockwork. Every Tuesday, a new envelope from the Whispering Pines HOA would appear in my mailbox. The fines escalated with comical speed. There was a $50 fine for failure to comply with community landscaping standards. There was a $100 fine for unauthorized agricultural activity, which I assumed was for my tomato plants. My favorite was the $200 citation for operating an unregulated water utility. I collected them in a folder, each one a little paper trophy of her delusion. Brenda's campaign moved online next. She took to the community Facebook group, a digital cesspool of gossip and passive aggression. She never used my name, of course. She was smarter than that. She referred to me only as the non-compliant property on the North Ridge. Her posts were masterpieces of manipulative propaganda. "It's so heartbreaking to see our beautiful neighborhood suffer in this drought," she would write, "especially when we know there is a private, unregulated well just feet from our community, hoarding precious water while our trees die. Some people just don't understand the meaning of neighbor." The comments section was a predictable chorus of her sycophants. "This is an outrage. Can't the county do something? He should be forced to share." A few brave souls tried to point out that my property wasn't part of the HOA, but they were quickly shouted down by Brenda's loyalists, who accused them of being anti-community. I watched it all with a kind of detached fascination. She was methodically turning me into the villain of her little suburban drama. I was the dragon on the hill, sitting on my hoard of liquid gold while the terrified villagers withered below. It was absurd, but it was also dangerous. Mob mentality is a powerful thing, even when the mob is armed with nothing more than hedge trimmers and a sense of entitlement. Her next move was to involve the county. A very bored-looking inspector from the Department of Environmental Quality showed up one afternoon. Brenda was with him, standing at the end of my driveway with a triumphant smirk on her face. She clearly expected him to march up to my well and slap a condemnation notice on it. "Sir, we've had a complaint about an illegal well," the inspector said, sighing as if he'd already had a long day of dealing with people like Brenda. I invited him onto the porch and offered him a glass of ice-cold water, which he gratefully accepted. I laid out my property deed, the original survey from 1922 that showed the property lines, and the county registration for the well, filed in 1958 as per the new regulations at the time. "It's all here," I said. "The well predates this entire county's regulatory framework. It's perfectly legal, fully registered, and located well within my property lines." The inspector looked through the documents, nodding slowly. He took another long drink of my well water. "Tastes good," he commented. He turned to Brenda, who was practically vibrating with impatience at the end of the driveway. "Ma'am," he called out, "this well is 100% legal and on private property. There's nothing the county can do. Have a nice day." He handed me back my papers, thanked me for the water, and left. Brenda's face was a mask of pure fury. Her smirk had curdled into a snarl. She had tried to use the system against me, and the system had sided with me. For her, this was an unforgivable betrayal. This was when her harassment escalated from bureaucratic nonsense to something more personal and sinister. The turning point, the moment my passive defense turned into a cold, calculated plan for war, came a week later. My sister, Sarah, and her 2 young kids came to visit for the weekend. We were having a barbecue in the backyard, the kids running through the sprinklers I had set up on my small patch of lawn. It was the first time I had felt genuinely happy in months. Then I saw her. Brenda was standing at her back fence, which bordered a section of my property. She wasn't just watching, she was filming us with her phone. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she yelled, her voice carrying across the yard. "Wasting water on a lawn while the rest of us can't even water our petunias. And letting those children run in it. It's probably not even safe. That well is probably full of bacteria." My nephew, who was only 6, started to cry. Sarah rushed over and scooped him up, glaring daggers at Brenda. "That's enough," I roared, my voice shaking with a rage I hadn't felt in years. "You are harassing my family. Get back in your house and leave us alone. I'm documenting this flagrant violation of water conservation ethics," she shrieked back. "The whole community will see how selfish you are." That night, after my sister and her shaken kids had gone to bed, I sat in the dark, the image of my nephew's tear-streaked face burned into my mind. This woman had brought her petty crusade to my family. She had tried to ruin a moment of simple joy. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The desire for peace drained out of me, replaced by something colder and harder. Justice. No, not just justice. Poetic justice. The kind of justice that is so complete, so perfectly tailored to the crime, that it becomes a work of art. She had attacked my water. My legacy. My family. I would use my knowledge of water, my legacy, and my methodical, scientific mind to dismantle her, piece by piece. The next morning, I drove into town and bought 4 high-definition trail cameras with night vision and audio recording capabilities. I also purchased a new home security system with cloud storage. The investigation had officially begun. My first step was to formalize my position. I drafted a clear, concise no trespassing letter. It cited the relevant state statutes and made it clear that any unauthorized entry onto my property by any member or agent of the Whispering Pines HOA would be met with immediate legal action. I sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested to every single member of the HOA board. It was a legal shot across the bow. Now, any entry would be knowingly and willfully illegal. Next, I delved into the history of my water rights. I was a hydrogeologist, but this was a matter of law. I spent a day at the county records office, a place that smelled of old paper and forgotten stories. I wasn't just looking for my well registration. I was looking for the original claim. After hours of sifting through brittle, leather-bound ledgers, I found it. There, in elegant, looping cursive from 1887, was my great-great-grandfather's name, claiming the spring and a flow rate of 20 gallons per minute for agricultural and domestic use. It was a senior water right, one of the oldest in the entire state. In the complex world of Western water law, this was the equivalent of a royal flush. The doctrine of prior appropriation is simple: first in time, first in right. My right to that water predated the HOA, the town, and in some cases, the county itself. It was legally untouchable. I made several high-resolution copies. This was my shield. With my own defenses fortified, I turned my attention to the enemy. It was time to investigate Brenda and the Whispering Pines HOA. I started with their public filings, their articles of incorporation, their bylaws, their annual budgets. It was all dry, boring stuff, but I read through it with the same focus I would apply to a seismic survey report. Then I started looking into the development itself. Who built Whispering Pines? A company called Miller Development, LLC. A quick search of state business records revealed the owner, Franklin Miller. Brenda's husband. That was interesting. It wasn't a crime, but it was a clear conflict of interest for her to be president of the HOA in a development her husband built. It smelled bad. The real question was the water. Why were they so desperate? A development of that size requires a will-serve letter from a water utility or a comprehensive geological survey proving adequate groundwater resources. Since they weren't on city water, they had to have their own wells. I pulled the public records for the development's water permits from the State Water Board. And that's when I found it. The weakness. The crack in their foundation. The entire approval for the 200-home subdivision was based on a single hydrogeological report. The report, signed and sealed by a firm I'd never heard of, certified that the aquifer beneath Whispering Pines could sustain a certain number of wells pumping a certain amount of water indefinitely. It was a rosy, optimistic report that practically promised an underground river of endless water. But I knew the geology of this area. I had my grandfather's old survey maps and my own professional knowledge. The aquifer they were tapping into was notoriously fickle. It was a perched aquifer, a limited pocket of water, not a deep, replenishing source. The report had to be wrong. Or worse, it had to be fraudulent. This discovery changed everything. This was no longer a simple case of harassment by a power-hungry HOA president. This was potentially a massive real estate fraud scheme. Brenda and her husband hadn't just built a subdivision, they had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies. They had sold 200 homes based on a promise of water that they had to have known didn't exist. Now I understood Brenda's obsession with my well. It wasn't just about envy or control. It was about survival. Her husband's development was running out of water, just as I suspected it would. The property values she was so obsessed with were about to plummet when the truth came out. My well, with its ancient, unassailable water rights, wasn't just a prize, it was a potential lifeline. If they could get control of it, they could pipe the water into their failing system and keep the skim going for a few more years. A cold, sharp clarity settled over me. I finally saw the whole picture. My grandfather's well was the key to their salvation, and they would stop at nothing to get it. The harassment, the fines, the public shaming, it was all a calculated campaign to either force me to sell or to create a pretext for seizing my property. I now had a working theory, but I needed proof. I needed to connect Brenda's actions directly to the water fraud. I needed to catch her in the act. And for that, I would need to set a trap. The plan that formed in my mind was methodical, a multi-phase project designed for maximum effect. I thought of it not as revenge, but as a controlled demolition. Brenda had built a fragile structure of lies and intimidation, and I was going to place strategic charges at its weakest points and bring the whole thing down. Phase 1 was baiting the trap. I needed to give Brenda a reason to believe she had an opportunity, a window to escalate her campaign from harassment to direct action. My sister's visit had already shown me how much my use of the water enraged her. It was time to pour gasoline on that fire. I spent the next weekend engaged in what I privately called Operation Lush Garden. I bought a new, top-of-the-line oscillating sprinkler and set it up in the most visible part of my yard, right along the property line she shared. I let it run for hours, casting sparkling rainbows of my well water into the dry summer air. I washed my truck, letting the water sheet down the driveway. I even bought a small inflatable pool and filled it to the brim, letting it sit there like a shimmering blue taunt. From my office window, I could see her watching. She would come out onto her deck, phone in hand, and just stare, her face a thunderous mask. The trap was being baited. She was taking the bait. Phase 2 was setting the stage for the crime. I knew she was getting more desperate. Her next move would likely be an attempt to sabotage the well itself. If she could get it declared a public health hazard, she might have a legal angle to force it to be capped. It was a long shot, but for a desperate person, a long shot is better than no shot at all. This is where my new cameras came into play. I didn't just mount them on trees. I am, after all, a man who understands the landscape. I concealed them meticulously. One was tucked inside a birdhouse my grandfather had built. Another was placed inside a hollowed-out log near the wellhead. A third was aimed from my workshop window, looking down on the entire area. They were all motion-activated, recording in 4K with high-fidelity audio, and uploading directly to a secure cloud server. Even if she found and destroyed the cameras, the evidence would be safe. The final piece of bait was the illusion of opportunity. I packed my truck on a Friday afternoon, making a very obvious show of loading up fishing gear and a cooler. I told my nearest neighbor, a decent fellow who stayed out of the HOA drama, that I was heading up to the mountains for a long weekend. I knew he was friendly with some of the other residents, and I knew the news would get back to Brenda within hours. The dragon was leaving his hoard unguarded. I didn't go to the mountains. I drove 10 miles down the road to a cheap motel with good Wi-Fi. I checked in, bought a 6-pack of beer and a pizza, and opened my laptop. I had a live feed from all 4 cameras. Now, all I had to do was wait. The first night was quiet. I watched a family of deer drink from the overflow pool near the well. A raccoon tried, and failed, to wash a piece of pizza it had stolen from someone's garbage. It was a peaceful night on the homestead, a stark contrast to the tension coiling in my gut. I dozed off around 2 in the morning, the laptop screen glowing beside me. The motion alert on my phone woke me up at 1:17 a.m. on Saturday. My heart hammered against my ribs. I sat bolt upright in the cheap motel bed and stared at the screen. 2 figures were moving stealthily across my backyard. The infrared night vision made them look like ghosts, their forms pale and shimmering. But there was no mistaking the determined, hunched-over walk of Brenda Miller. The second figure was a man I recognized from the HOA meetings, George, the head of the Architectural Control Committee, a man who wielded his power over fence heights and mailbox colors like a Roman emperor. My hands were shaking as I maximized the feed from the camera in the hollow log, the one closest to the wellhead. The audio kicked in, a whisper of static and crickets. I cranked up the volume. "Are you sure he's gone?" George whispered, his voice tinny through the laptop speakers. "Positive," Brenda hissed back. "Marcy next door saw him leave. He won't be back until Monday. Now, hurry up." They reached the stone wellhead. George was carrying a small duffel bag. Brenda was holding a flashlight, keeping the beam pointed at the ground. My blood ran cold. This was it. "Okay, what's the plan again?" George asked, his voice trembling slightly. He was clearly out of his depth. He was a bully on paper, not in the dark. "It's simple," Brenda said, her voice dripping with venomous confidence. "We're not going to destroy it. That would be too obvious. We're just going to make it sick." She took a small bottle out of her purse. "This is a concentrated animal-based fertilizer. Harmless in small doses, but a few drops of this down the well shaft, and in a week, the coliform bacteria levels will be off the charts. I've already got the county health department's number on speed dial. I'll make an anonymous tip about a foul smell. They'll come test it, declare it contaminated, and order it sealed permanently." I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made me dizzy. I was watching them, listening to them, as they plotted to destroy a piece of my family's soul. It was more than I could have hoped for. It was a confession, a conspiracy, all wrapped up in a neat little 4K package. "And then what?" George asked. "And then," Brenda said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "with his well gone, he'll be desperate. The county will force him to hook up to a water source. Our water source. We'll offer to connect him to the community system, for a price. A very high price. And in exchange for that, he'll have to grant the HOA an easement to his defunct well for future exploration." She was practically purring. It was the sound of a predator closing in for the kill. George fumbled with the heavy cap on the wellhead. "It's heavy," he grunted. "Just get it open," Brenda ordered. I watched, my breath held, as they struggled with the iron cap. And then I did something I hadn't planned on. My grandfather had installed a simple, hidden locking mechanism on the cap years ago after some teenagers had tried to throw rocks down it. A small, almost invisible pin that had to be turned. They didn't know about it. They pulled and they grunted, their whispers turning into frustrated curses. They couldn't get it open. After 5 minutes of fruitless struggle, they gave up. "It's rusted shut or something," George panted. Brenda let out a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. "Fine," she spat. "Fine. We'll come back with a crowbar. But this isn't over. I will get that water." They retreated back into the darkness, two frustrated ghosts melting back into the beige suburbia they came from. I sat there in the silence of the motel room, the camera feed showing my empty, peaceful yard. My hands were steady now. The shaking was gone, replaced by an icy calm. I had them. They had failed to commit the crime, but they had fully confessed their intent. Conspiracy to commit property damage. Attempted criminal mischief. It was more than enough. I saved the video file in 3 separate locations. Then I leaned back against the cheap headboard and allowed myself a small, cold smile. The trap had been sprung. The demolition was proceeding on schedule. Phase 3, the public reveal, was next. And I knew just the venue. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile, beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine from the adjacent pool. I had never attended one before. My arrival caused a small stir. Heads turned. People whispered behind their hands. I was the monster from the North Ridge, making a rare appearance among the villagers. I found a seat in the back row and waited. Brenda was in her element. She stood at a lectern at the front of the room, wielding her gavel like a scepter. She ran through the agenda with ruthless efficiency, a debate over the approved shade of taupe for mailbox posts, a stern lecture about putting garbage cans out too early, a passive-aggressive reminder about picking up after pets. It was a masterclass in petty tyranny. Finally, she arrived at the main event. "And now," she announced, her voice taking on a somber tone, "we must discuss a very serious issue affecting the well-being of our entire community. I'm referring, of course, to the ongoing water crisis and the unneighborly behavior of the non-compliant property." All eyes turned to me. I met their gazes with a placid expression. "This individual," she continued, her voice filled with righteous indignation, "continues to flaunt his private water source, wasting thousands of gallons on a green lawn while our properties wither. He has refused all reasonable requests to share this community resource. He has shown a callous disregard for his neighbors." George, sitting at the board table, nodded gravely. "It's a slap in the face to all of us who are following the rules," he chimed in. "Therefore," Brenda declared, "the board is proposing a new resolution. A special assessment of $5,000 per household to fund a legal challenge to seize control of this rogue well under the doctrine of eminent domain for the public good." An uproar went through the room. $5,000 was a lot of money, even for this affluent community. People started shouting. It was chaos. Brenda banged her gavel, a smug smile on her face. She was creating a crisis and then selling them the expensive, fraudulent solution. "Are there any comments?" she asked, her eyes daring me to speak. I stood up slowly. The room fell silent. "I have a comment," I said, my voice calm and carrying easily in the quiet room. "You are not a member of this association," Brenda snapped. "You have no right to speak." "Oh, I think your members will want to hear what I have to say," I replied smoothly. "Especially since it concerns how their $5,000 would be spent. You see, you've painted me as a selfish water hoarder. But I think there's another side to this story." I pulled a small Bluetooth speaker from my jacket pocket and placed it on the chair in front of me. "I have a recording I'd like to play for you all. It's a bit of late-night nature audio I captured on my property last weekend. The sound quality is excellent." Brenda's face went pale. George looked like he was about to be sick. I pressed play. The sound of crickets filled the room, and then, a familiar whisper. "Are you sure he's gone?" It was George's voice, tinny and nervous. A gasp went through the crowd. Then Brenda's voice, sharp and clear. "Hurry up. We're not going to destroy it. We're just going to make it sick." I let the recording play, her entire venomous plan spilling into the silent, stunned room. Her plot to contaminate my well with bacteria. Her scheme to have it condemned. Her plan to extort me for access. Every damning word echoed off the beige walls. When the recording finished, there was a moment of absolute, profound silence. You could have heard a pin drop on the industrial-grade carpet. Everyone was staring at Brenda, their faces a mixture of shock, confusion, and dawning horror. Brenda stood frozen at the lectern, her face the color of ash. The mask of the benevolent community leader had been ripped away, revealing the snarling predator beneath. She found her voice first. It came out as a strangled shriek. "That's a fake. A fabrication. He's doctored it. He's a liar." George was sweating profusely, looking at the exit like a cornered rat. "It's a very convincing fabrication, then," I said calmly. "I have the original 4K video file as well, if you'd like to see it. It shows your faces quite clearly." I was going to bring a projector, but I thought just the audio would be more dramatic. Brenda completely lost control. "You have no right," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You spied on me. You violated my privacy. I'll sue you. I'll sue you for slander, for defamation. I'll own you. I'll own that well." Her meltdown was spectacular. The more she raged, the more she confirmed her guilt. The residents were backing away from her, their expressions hardening from shock to disgust. They had been played. They had been lied to. They had almost been conned into funding a criminal enterprise. I picked up my speaker. "I think my point is made," I said to the room at large. "The proposal to fund a legal challenge seems ill-advised. If you'll excuse me, I have a garden to water." I turned and walked out of the clubhouse, leaving behind the smoking crater of Brenda Miller's reputation. The first charge had detonated perfectly. Her social credibility was gone. But I knew this wasn't over. A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Her public humiliation would only fuel a more desperate, more vicious retaliation. And I would be ready for it. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate and glorious. The community Facebook page, once Brenda's personal propaganda machine, turned on her with the ferocity of a starved wolf pack. The audio file I'd played was leaked. I may have anonymously sent it to a few of the more vocal residents, and it spread like wildfire. The proposed $5,000 legal fund was dead on arrival. A petition to recall Brenda as president gained 100 signatures in a single night. But as I had predicted, her public shaming didn't make her retreat, it made her double down. She was no longer just trying to get my water, she was trying to destroy my life. The war went from cold to hot overnight. She started by filing a police report. She twisted the narrative of her late-night visit, claiming she had seen me, in the dark, dumping suspicious-looking barrels near my well. It was a transparently vindictive lie, a clumsy attempt to use her own failed plan against me. 2 sheriff's deputies showed up at my door the next day. They were polite but firm. They had a report to investigate. "Sir, we have a complaint about illegal dumping of hazardous materials," the older deputy said. I just nodded. "I've been expecting you," I said. "Would you like to see the video?" I invited them in and played the full, unedited video from that night on my large television screen. I showed them the crystal-clear footage of Brenda and George trespassing. I showed them the time stamps. I showed them arriving empty-handed and leaving empty-handed. Then I walked them out to the well, where there were, of course, no barrels. The deputies looked at each other. The older one sighed and took off his hat, rubbing his forehead. "Filing a false police report is a serious offense, you know." "I'm aware," I said. "And I'd like to press charges." They took my statement, collected a copy of the video file, and left. Another charge was laid against Brenda's account. But she wasn't done. Her next attack was aimed at my livelihood. I worked as a remote consultant for a large environmental engineering firm. My reputation for integrity was everything. A week after the police visit, I got a call from my boss, a goodman named David. His voice was troubled. "We received an email," he said. "An anonymous one. It accuses you of falsifying data on the old Riverbend project. It claims you have a history of academic dishonesty and that your professional license is under review. My blood ran cold. This was a direct shot at my career. The accusations were baseless, of course, but in my field, even the suggestion of impropriety can be devastating. It was Brenda Miller, I said, my voice tight with rage. I figured as much, David replied. It had the hysterical tone of a scorned HOA president. Don't worry, I'm not taking it seriously. But you need to shut this down. This woman is unhinged. He was right. She had escalated beyond reason. She was a wounded animal, lashing out blindly and viciously. It was time to end it. I had been holding back my ace in the hole, the evidence of the fraudulent water report. I had wanted to let Brenda dig her own grave, but now she was trying to pull me into it with her. It was time to bring in the heavy machinery and bury her for good. And then, as if on cue, the universe delivered the final piece of the puzzle. The whistleblower. I got an email from an anonymous address. The subject line was, Whispering Pines. The body of the message was short. I know what the Millers did. I have the proof. Meet me. We met in a small, dingy coffee shop in the next town over. He was a man in his 60s named Arthur. He was a retired geologist, and he looked like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had been the lead surveyor for a reputable firm hired by Miller Development 10 years ago to assess the groundwater for the Whispering Pines project. I told them it wouldn't work, he said, his hands trembling as he stirred his coffee. I told Frank Miller to his face. The aquifer is too small, too shallow. It could maybe support 50 homes, max. Not 200. My official report made that perfectly clear. The report filed with the county says the opposite, I said. Arthur nodded grimly. He fired my firm. Buried my report. Then he hired some fly-by-night company, a couple of kids fresh out of college, to write him a new one. Paid them a fortune to sign off on a lie. I've lived with it for 10 years. But when I heard what his wife was doing to you, trying to steal your family's water because of the shortage I predicted, I couldn't stay silent anymore. He slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a copy of the fraudulent report that had been filed with the county. The second was a copy of his original, suppressed report. The real one. The one that proved, beyond any doubt, that the entire Whispering Pines development was built on a foundation of criminal fraud. This is the smoking gun, Arthur, I said, my voice filled with a quiet awe. Thank you. Just nail them, he said, his eyes pleading. Nail them to the wall. Now I had everything. The final, undeniable proof. It was time to move from defense to offense. It was time to involve the higher authorities. I spent the next 2 days compiling my case. I organized everything into a thick, 3-ring binder, complete with a table of contents and tabbed sections. It was a work of art, a testament to methodical rage. Section A, Property and Water Rights. It contained my deed, the 1887 water rights filing, and a detailed geological map of the area. Section B, Harassment Campaign. It held copies of every fine, the printouts from the Facebook group, and a log of every interaction with Brenda. Section C, Criminal Conspiracy. This was the heart of it. A USB drive with the full video of the attempted well tampering, my sworn affidavit, and the sheriff's report number for the false dumping accusation. Section D, the fraud. This was the kill shot. It contained Arthur's original report, the fraudulent report, and a detailed analysis I had written comparing the two, highlighting the falsified data points and impossible conclusions. I made 4 copies of the binder. The first went to the district attorney's office, along with a formal request for criminal charges for conspiracy, filing a false police report, and felony real estate fraud. The second went to the State Water Resources Board, with a complaint detailing the fraudulent water survey and the imminent collapse of the Whispering Pines water system. The third went to the State Real Estate Commission, demanding an investigation into Miller Development for selling properties under false pretenses. The fourth copy I kept for myself. The wheels of justice began to turn, slowly at first, and then with gathering speed. Investigators from all 3 agencies contacted me. I walked them through the evidence. I connected them with Arthur, who gave a full deposition. The case against the Millers was ironclad, a prosecutor's dream. The final showdown was not at an HOA meeting. It was bigger than that. The State Water Board, citing a potential public health emergency, called a mandatory community meeting for all residents of Whispering Pines. The venue was the high school auditorium. It was a formal, serious affair. The room was packed. The residents were scared and angry. Rumors had been flying for weeks. The officials on the stage were grim-faced, the head of the State Water Board, a lead investigator from the DA's office, and a county commissioner. Brenda and Frank Miller were there, sitting in the front row. They looked arrogant and defiant, as if they believed they could bully their way out of this, too. They thought this meeting was about water rationing. They had no idea it was their own public execution. The head of the water board opened the meeting. He explained that the community's water system was failing and that the aquifer was on the verge of collapse. He then introduced the investigator from the DA's office, who spoke about a complex and far-reaching investigation into the development's origins. And then, he called my name. To explain the technical details of the water situation, and how it connects to this investigation, we've asked a local expert to present his findings. I walked up to the podium, my binder in my hand. A projector screen hummed to life behind me. I saw Brenda's face tighten, her eyes narrowing with hate. She still didn't get it. I started calmly. I put up a map of my property, showed them the 1887 water rights document. I explained the law, the history. I established my unassailable right to my own water. Then, I moved on to her. For months, I said, my voice steady, the HOA president, Brenda Miller, has waged a campaign of harassment and intimidation to force me to turn over this water right. A campaign which culminated in this. I played the video. The full, high-definition video of Brenda and George in my backyard. I played it on the giant screen, for all her neighbors to see. The audio boomed through the auditorium's sound system. Her plot, her words, her intent, laid bare for everyone. The room was deathly silent, the only sound the crickets chirping on the recording. Frank Miller was staring at his wife in horror. Brenda was shaking, her face a blotchy red. But I wasn't finished. You might be asking yourselves, why? Why would she be so desperate? Why would she risk criminal charges to get my water? I clicked to the next slide. Because she and her husband knew a secret. They knew your community was running out of water from the day they sold the first house. I put up Arthur's report and the fraudulent report, side by side. I walked the entire room through the data, explaining in simple terms how the numbers were faked, how the geology was misrepresented. I showed them, with cold, hard facts, that their homes, their biggest investments, were built on a deliberate, calculated lie. They sold you a dream, I concluded, my voice ringing with conviction, and they knew it was going to turn into a nightmare of dry wells and collapsing property values. My well wasn't for the good of the community, it was a patch for their crime, a way to keep the lie going for a few more years. That's when Brenda finally broke. She leaped to her feet, her face contorted with pure, undiluted rage. Lies, she screamed, her voice cracking. He's a thief. He's trying to ruin us. Frank, do something. Frank Miller, however, was already being approached by two plainclothes detectives who had been sitting in the audience. He put his head in his hands and seemed to shrink into his expensive suit. Brenda's tirade continued. She accused me, the DA, the water board. In her hysterical meltdown, she started confessing. We had to get that report. The first one was too negative. No one would have invested. We built this community. It was the final nail in her coffin. The lead investigator from the DA's office stood up and walked over to her. Brenda Miller, he said, his voice calm but firm. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit property damage, filing a false police report, and multiple counts of felony fraud. A second pair of detectives moved in. They took her arms. The sight of this tyrannical woman, who had lorded her petty power over so many, suddenly being rendered powerless was breathtaking. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard. As they led her away, past the rows of her stunned and betrayed neighbors, she locked eyes with me. Her face was a mask of pure hatred. You haven't heard the last of me, she shrieked, her voice echoing in the silent auditorium. I'll own that well. I'll see you in hell. It was her last, impotent threat. A hollow gust of wind from a storm that had already passed. I just stood there at the podium and watched until she was gone. The demolition was complete. In the aftermath, the Whispering Pines Estates HOA collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. With the Millers facing a mountain of criminal charges and a tidal wave of civil lawsuits from the homeowners they had defrauded, the entire structure fell apart. The development was put into state receivership. The ridiculous rules about mailbox colors and lawn maintenance vanished overnight. The community didn't die, though. It healed. Freed from Brenda's oppressive reign, the residents started talking to each other, not as rule enforcers and violators, but as neighbors. They formed a new, democratic water board to deal with the crisis her husband had created. It was a long, expensive road for them, involving drilling a new, much deeper well and implementing real conservation measures, but they faced it together. The beige stucco boxes started to feel like a real community. I became something of a reluctant local hero. People would wave as they drove by my property. Sometimes a bottle of wine or a freshly baked pie would appear on my porch. The new board officially sent me a letter, formally apologizing for Brenda's actions and affirming, in writing, that they recognized my property and water rights as completely separate and inviolable. They even offered to pay for any legal fees I had incurred. I politely declined. The satisfaction was payment enough. As for Brenda and Frank, their downfall was absolute. They were convicted on nearly all charges. The sheer scale of their fraud, affecting 200 families, earned them no leniency from the judge. Frank got 10 years in state prison for the fraud. Brenda got 5 years for her role, plus the additional charges of conspiracy and filing a false report. They were financially annihilated, forced to pay millions in restitution to the homeowners. They lost their big house, their fancy cars, their social standing. They lost everything. Their names became a local cautionary tale, a synonym for arrogance and greed. I often think about the whole ordeal. I had come back to my grandfather's land seeking peace, a quiet place to mourn and heal. Instead, I had been drawn into a war. But in fighting that war, in defending my legacy, I had found something I didn't expect. A sense of purpose. A reaffirmation of the values my grandfather had taught me: stand your ground, protect what's yours, and never let a bully win. It was about more than just water. It was about the principle that you can't just take what doesn't belong to you, whether it's a piece of land, a flow of water, or a person's peace of mind. Brenda believed her power and position made her untouchable, that her desires superseded my rights. She learned, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that she was wrong. The law, like water, can be a patient but powerful force. It finds the cracks in a faulty foundation and, over time, brings the whole corrupt structure crashing down. Today, life is quiet again on the North Ridge. The seasons turn, the pines whisper in the wind, and the well continues its steady, faithful flow. Sometimes, on a warm evening, I'll sit on the porch, a glass of that cold, clear water in my hand. It tastes of stone and time and the deep, silent places of the earth. It tastes of history, of family, of a legacy defended. It tastes like victory. The peace I have now is not the passive peace I started with. It's a peace I fought for, a peace I earned. And that, I've come to realize, is the sweetest peace of all.